I want to tell you about a massive leak. Millions of financial records, dubbed the Paradise Papers, shining a light on the secretive world of offshore tax havens. A trove of documents obtained by a German newspaper and shared now by the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists. The documents give us a glimpse of where the world's financial elite stashed their cash in offshore accounts. Among the 3,000-plus Canadians named, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau's chief fundraiser, Stephen Bronfman, his Montreal-based investment company, linked to a $76 million trust in the Cayman Islands. Also, U.S. Commerce Secretary Wilbur Ross, who has a stake in a shipping company with ties to Russian leader Vladimir Putin. Even the Queen, her private estate, has invested millions of dollars offshore. Now, beyond wealthy individuals, the leak shows how corporate giants like Apple and Uber use creative bookkeeping to avoid taxes, which may not be illegal, but often does not sit well in the home countries. All right, for more on that story, let's go to Will Fitzgibbon, reporter at the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists. He was one of the lead journalists on the investigation. Thanks for joining us today.
Good to be here.
Well, it's a complicated investigation, that much we understand. But let's begin with the Canadian connection here. I want to begin with Stephen Bronfman and what more of these papers revealed about his and his business investments.
So what emerges from these papers, which we're referring to collectively as the Paradise Papers, is a whole series of transactions involving different offshore entities, largely in the Cayman Islands, that seem to show transfers of money among and between trusts, and include faxes, emails and discussions that seem to talk about some of these financial transactions involving important Canadian figures in ways that experts, ICOJ and our partners, the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, seem to suggest might not be quite kosher.
Might not be quite what, sorry?
Kosher.
Meaning what?
Meaning that, as you pointed out, while there's not necessarily evidence of smoking gun wrongdoing here, the whole existence of, and as many experts say, the whole problem with some of these secretive offshore entities is that money can be moved in ways that the taxman, be it in Canada or be it elsewhere, might not be able to follow. And once they do learn about it, through leaks like the Paradise Papers, may choose to take action to see if anything was amiss.
All right, so there are investments, money made that somehow the taxes aren't getting paid back home. One of the other names that comes up when you looked at these papers is Wilbur Ross, the U.S. Commerce Secretary. Tell me about that.
This is an interesting one, and as you said, a really, really complicating one. What we see here is that Wilbur Ross, the Commerce Secretary, one of the key Trump cabinet officials charged with making America great again, has a stake in a shipping firm, and that shipping firm has been receiving millions and millions of dollars of revenue from a company whose key owners include the son-in-law of the president of Russia, Vladimir Putin, and other Russian oligarchs who have now been sanctioned by the United States. So there's a real question here from the Paradise Papers as to how and why a key member of the US administration is involved in a company doing deals with Russian entities that many experts say are extremely close to President Putin.
So one thing I do want to ask you is how recent is the paperwork? How recent are these transactions? Are we talking about things that happened before sanctions were in place, for example, or are these relatively new?
Well, the documents in the Ross case in particular are new. We're talking about recent years. It's important to specify that Wilbur Ross told ICOJ and partners that the deal with the Russian shipping firm was signed before he was involved in the company, but those transactions have continued and that money has been made while he was involved in that company. Broadly speaking, the data from Paradise Papers goes back 50 years and includes revelations and details up until 2016.
All right, so let me go back to Stephen Bronfman for a moment and just ask you whether or not you reached out to him for comment and whether you got one.
Yes, we certainly did. This is a project that hundreds of journalists have worked on for nearly a year now, so everyone was contacted and all those responses included in the stories. In the case of the Canadian story, we were told that there was no wrongdoing and illegality and that the offshore dealings were declared. As you said at the beginning of this introduction, what we're seeing here is very complicated offshore stuff, and there's often a fine line between what is legal and illegal and what is merely seen by a growing number of countries and public officials as abusive and that should be cracked down upon. And I think that's why offshore investigations like the Panama Papers are important, because it reveals an economic system that many people simply don't know about and that governments have said repeatedly they wish to reform.
Yeah, quite often it raises a lot more questions that need to be answered without necessarily, as you say, coming to conclusions with what is in the papers. Will Fitzgibbon, so thank you for joining us. We'll check in with you maybe a little later today. Thanks for that.
Thank you very much.